Welcome to Leadership Journey, part of the Group Talk network of podcasts. Join Bill Search as he walks you through biblical Christian leadership, gives you keys to personal growth and development, as well as dynamics of leading others that honors God. Open your heart and mind and enjoy Leadership Journey with Bill Search.
Well, welcome back to the Leadership Journey. I'm your host, Bill Search, and I'm delighted to share with you a recording I had the privilege of making with none other than John Ortberg. He had visited my church here in Oklahoma City, Crossings Community Church, and in the process of the time that he spent here with our church, with our leaders, I was able to sit down and record with him around the topic of Christian leadership. I know you're going to enjoy this recording. It's set up a little bit differently, so I hope you get to view it, but I know you'll get to listen to it. It'll be a special time, so thank you very much for joining me and John Ortberg on the Leadership Journey. Well, I'm sitting down here with a friend of Crossings Community Church, John Ortberg, who's, of course, a published author of numerous books, a veteran pastor of both Midwest and West Coast. And it's a real privilege, John, to have you on the podcast today to talk about leadership from a Christian point of view. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Bill. Crossings has become just a very meaningful place to me. And so I'm glad to be here and get to see you again, not in California where we have met before, but in Oklahoma.
Well, it is, Oklahoma is definitely not on most people's bucket list, but I always tell people once you move here, you'll never leave. Yeah. It's a pretty remarkable place. So, well, I want to talk to you about leadership because you have such a proven track record in this arena, and the people listening are in some capacity or another leading. They might be paid in a ministry, and they might also just serve as volunteers and could run the gamut from working with kids to working with adults. But just taking a very, very high view of this topic, when you're remembered as a leader, years and years from now, what would you like people to say about you?
There's a wonderful statement from Dallas Willard, who somebody influenced me a lot. And he used to say, the main thing God gets out of your life is the person you become. And that we tend to focus on what's the resume, what are my achievements, and I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, so I can be very focused on what have I done and what do people think about what I have done. So even asking the question of what do I want people to think of me is a little dangerous because it goes into my shadow territory. But to have become someone who really loves people, I would love for that to be true. We're recording this during the Lenten season, and I'm working on spending some time each day just reflecting on the previous day. Who was I with? What did I notice about them? What's going on in their hearts? How could I pray for them? Is there anything that I could do just to try to get a little bit better at love? So if I could choose anything, it would be you love me.
John, for those of us who know you through your writings or your preaching, that's one of the things that people do love about you is that comes out in the messaging so strong. So often, it's interesting, many people, the response to that question would be things they led, things they touched. But just to bring it back down to what this is really all about, it's the people. Leadership is a people-centric enterprise, and that you'd notice that. That's good. I find that encouraging. I find that challenging.
Yeah.
That's such a great reminder. Well, on that note, over the last 20, 30 years, maybe longer, there has been a great deal of influence that the business or the commercial sector has had on the church. I mean, for generations in church work, church leaders spoke to church leaders about the church work, and then beginning really in the modern era, we began to look at people like Jim Collins and Marcus Buckingham and other influential writers, Malcolm Gladwell. These are all great writers, great thinkers. And so that's come into the church. And so more and more church leaders refer to those folks. What's been good about that influence within the church, and what's maybe been some of the not so good as a result of that business enterprise coming into the church setting?
Yeah, I think the good part of it is people are people. Human nature is human nature. Organizations or communities are communities, and there's certain constants around that. So to be able to cast a noble vision that inspires people, that's a really good thing. To be able to marshal resources and leverage them effectively against a worthy mission, that's a good thing. To be able to evaluate, now these resources are not working well, to be able to get the right person lined up with the right job and give them feedback and be developmental so that they can get better. To build a team, have the right people on the right chairs in the team, have the team moving in the right direction, have the team be healthy. All of those things, I think, are wonderful gifts. I think we've all had the experience. One of the early great leaders that I had was when I was in high school and I sang in the choir. This guy named Lenny Lundstrom, and I did not know it then. He was a very good musician, but he was a great leader. And there are certain mantras. We would kill ourselves to try to sing really well for Lenny. And other people would give out praise like candy. He did not give praise unless you had done really well. So we would work really hard for that. And one of his mantras was we would, sing very hard through a technical part of some song, and he would just pause and say, "Do it again, do it again." And anybody who sang under him, they would be able to quote that now many, many decades later. So those capacities that leaders bring to call out the best in us, to cast a vision of what might be, those are wonderful. And I think there are lots of folks. I love Abraham Lincoln. I cannot get enough of. I'm always reading some Lincoln book or another. And so to learn about leadership through people like that is a great gift. I think the dark side of it is when we start to think about the church in terms of metrics, results, celebrity culture, the glamorization of leaders, we can start to create cultures that reinforce narcissism. It's interesting. A guy who is on the board of the ministry organization my wife leads is Pat Gelsinger, and Pat's the CEO of Intel. He's an amazing
That's a pretty
leader.
good job.
He was named a few years ago the least narcissistic CEO in America.
It's funny that there's like a tracking of that.
There actually is. They had metrics. They developed in the annual report of the corporation, how big was the picture of the CEO, and how often is the name of the CEO mentioned, and how many times does the CEO use the pronouns I, me, mine. So there were all these ways of monitoring, and Pat was named, literally, you look it up, the least narcissistic CEO in America. I think sometimes in the church world, when we import stuff from that, along with that, we can import some of the worst parts of it. And I think because churches are residential spiritual communities, and the leaders often are also people that stand up on the platform and talk about life, virtue, love, excellence, God, and try to embody that, a cult of celebrity.
Yeah.
And people identifying with the leader, where a lot of the tone of the church is, how's the leader doing? Is he happy? Is he doing well? He's my guy. There's a lot of stuff that feeds into that cult of celebrity, narcissism, lack of accountability. That's a real problem.
It's interesting you bring up that cult of celebrity, because that sometimes is in business, like with the era of Steve Jobs at Apple. There's no question, cult of personality, keen insight, that sort of thing. But where he's remembered for really the products, the innovation and so forth, not for some trend he started. And as celebrity culture has come into church, as we talk about this, just not long ago was a very famous podcast about a church in the Pacific Northwest that was all about that sort of thing. And yet when you're in the midst of it, you're not always the best judge of the toxicity of it. So how could someone listening, because so many of our churches do use those business examples and so forth, and as you pointed out, some of that's really great stuff. Is there any sort of internal barometer a leader could use to say, that's a bridge too far?
Yeah. I was listening to somebody the other day who's a really good thinker, New Testament theologian, and he was saying he doesn't like the word leadership. He just likes the word followership. And I get that. I think it's a wonderful point in a lot of ways. I think the need for humility and needing to be a follower is a very important thing. When Jesus talked about leadership, most often it was to warn people about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's because we all have a kingdom. Your kingdom is the reign of your effective will. It's very hard to lead people without violating their kingdom.
Yeah.
And I think sin always gets into everything. And the better and more powerful something is when it's good, the worse it is when sin infects it.
Oh, wow.
So I think because leadership can impact so many people, that's why leadership is so toxic when it becomes damaged. I was talking to some people very recently about a system that they're in where clearly there is toxicity and unhealth. I think one question to ask is, if I was on the outside looking into this situation, how would it sound? And those podcasts from Mars Hill were fascinating. If you're listening from the outside and you hear a story, you think, how can anybody tolerate that? Who would put up with that? When you're inside, it feels totally different. God is at work. Amazing things are happening. I'm not sure that I'm correct about this. So just asking the question, pretend for a moment that I was completely outside the system. I didn't know any of these names. Somebody described to me these behaviors, these comments, these words, these dynamics. Would I say that that's crazy, unhealthy, and needs to be addressed? Or would I say, nope, I think that's really on target? I think that'd help people a ton.
That's just what we need to hear, is that kind of insight of outside looking in. Would I say, you think about that could be in a family, that could be in a dating relationship. There's just so many places where you can plug that one in.
That's exactly right. If you are living in a crazy system, you have to be crazy to survive.
Yeah.
So if you're in a marriage with an alcoholic and you want to keep being married, then you have to adjust your own responses, your approach to accountability, honesty. You have to cramp in order to make space for that. And but the problem is, when you've been in that system for a long time, it feels normal from the inside. It looks and feels like, yeah, this is just ordinary life.
It's sort of like that pound or two you put on every year.
Yeah.
And then after 10 or 15 years, the doctor says, do you realize what's become of your health?
No, I had no idea.
Yeah. It was just one Dorito too many. All right. That's all heavy stuff. So let's come up for air a little bit, shifting gears. You could sit down over a cup of coffee with 3 leaders from history. Who do you sit down with?
Yeah. Abraham Lincoln for sure. Jesus, it kind of goes without saying.
That's your only Bible one. You got Jesus,
okay.
So nobody else from the Bible. Lincoln, Jesus.
I also enjoy a lot reading about Winston Churchill.
Oh.
And I think partly because I love communication, and his communication was so extraordinary. And he was just such a colorful character.
Oh, he was a masterful politician who didn't always make people happy, and occasionally, he wins the Second World War and shortly thereafter is voted out of office. And so it goes, but then he's back in, I guess. So.
There's a lot of people who would say basically he had about 18 months when England stood alone against Hitler and his speeches rallied everybody. Yeah. And he got it right then and was wrong for much, if not most, of the rest of his career. But I would love to be at a dinner with him.
Boy, he might have tea, not coffee, but I like your choice.
He would have whiskey.
I think he would, which would make the whole thing more colorful. Yeah. Certainly. Okay. Years ago, I was introduced to a concept that, especially for Christian leaders, that using the example of the Apostle Paul, is that everybody needs a Paul in their life, someone who's building into them, challenging them, maturing them, and everybody needs a Timothy, somebody that if you've gotten to a place of your own spiritual life that you can pour into others. So with that in mind, where do you go looking for a Paul? Where do you go looking for a Timothy? I imagine in your life, I know Dallas Willard has been a Paul to you. So how do you find these people?
Yeah. I have been, I was talking to a friend about this not too long ago, just extraordinarily fortunate in a number of people. The first pastor I worked for, John F. Anderson, was a person of immense joy, believed in me, encouraged me. And then David Hubbard from Fuller Seminary, a guy named Lou Smedes that was also from Fuller, Neil Warren, a guy named Max Dupree, who's an amazing leader, a guy named Sam Reeves, Dallas Willard for sure. So I have been, and I don't know why, just extraordinarily fortunate. I had a good relationship with my dad, and I think in some ways that kind of set me up for those kind of relationships.
By the way, everybody listening to this of a certain vintage just kind of turned a little green with envy because you mentioned some
just amazing people,
stellar names there.
Yeah. I had a preaching teacher, Ian Pitt Watson, who would be on that list also.
Did Max Dupree give you any Herman Miller furniture just from that relationship? I mean, did you come away with an Eames fiberglass chair?
I don't have any of Max's furniture, but Max passed away just a couple of years ago, and I did his service. And
for those listening, Max Dupree was the head honcho of Herman Miller office. I'm correct on that.
No, that's exactly right.
I'm a Michigan native, so
kidding.
Yeah, Max was a legend in that state for what he did in turning office furniture into something that wasn't boring, but now we have around our dinner table.
Yep. And there's 1,000 Max Dupree stories about the nature of leadership. Yeah. First task of a leader is to define reality.
Yeah.
And so I have lots and lots of wisdom from Max. But no, he didn't give me any furniture at all. I don't know what that's about.
Well, okay.
But I would say look for somebody that you can learn a lot from and that you deeply admire. And then there has to be a certain level of chemistry. They have to want to be around you.
Yeah.
And for people who are looking for someone like that, I think it's important to take it one step at a time. Sometimes a person will approach a stranger and ask, will you mentor me? And trying to go from 0 to 100, I think, is not a good idea. So ask for a single conversation and bring some value to them. A thought, an idea, expressions of appreciation, buy them coffee.
Yeah.
And so take that relationship one step at a time. And then I think it's the same thing on the other hand, getting older, to ask, who can I pour back into? And I've had to be more intentional about that, Bill. I found being a mentee, for whatever reason of health or unhealth, came very naturally to me. Being a mentor, I have less clarity as to whether I'm being helpful for someone or not.
And everyone listening right now is like, I'll sign up to have John mentor me, and it'll be of great value.
Well,
but I hear what you're saying. There is that sense where did this conversation help you in some way?
What I find is if I give a talk, I have a sense, I may be off, but I have a pretty clear sense of, yep, I think that was really helpful, or nope, I feel like that missed the mark, and why. If I have an hour conversation with somebody, I'm much fuzzier on that. Yeah. And I think there are people whose wiring is different, who are naturally great coaches, who, when they got to the end of a talk, they'd be able to take you back to, this was a key moment. Right here, I saw that person was really moved. Here, I could have challenged them, but I didn't. And so I have to be more of a student of, that's part of why, like I mentioned before, I'm trying to take some time each day to think back on my encounters with people the previous day and look at how are they doing? What did they say? What was their mood like? Part of that is because I'm trying to get better at those conversations and how can I serve to mentor or coach? Because I feel like I got such a gift from that, but it doesn't feel to me like it comes nearly as naturally as giving talks does.
Well, it just, in there, so much wisdom of you need to have the built-in reflective space to think back on the conversation, to think about what was said, what you said, what they said. Was that helpful? I think in my own life, I tend to move from thing to thing to thing, appointment to appointment to appointment without the reflective space. So you're just giving me something to chew on there. And I imagine those who are listening, that's something to chew on right there, is of the people that God's put in my path that I have some sort of influence over. What do I know about them? What do I know about their needs?
I was just talking the other day to a guy who's written a wonderful book, Managing Leadership Anxiety.
Steve Cuss. That is a terrific book.
Isn't it? Yeah,
Oh,
it's a brilliant book.
Yes.
But he was talking about his model of development as he was being educated for ministry. It's super simple. It's action, reflection, action.
Yeah.
And that was just built into his education process. And there used to be CPE, clinical pastoral education, in certain traditions.
Yeah.
And so that engage in ministry, preaching, counseling, leading, whatever, and then you take a chunk of time to write and reflect on it.
Yeah.
What happened? How did I experience it? What worked? What didn't? Where was God in it? And then take that back into your next activity. And I think just something as simple as that model would serve people well. But you're right. A lot of us get so anxious to get stuff done that we don't do the reflection part. And we really short circuit our growth because we just end up making the same mistakes over and over.
We always have these debates about breadth and depth. And so often we end up shallow because we're just spread too thin.
Yes.
And that's not news. We've known that forever. Franklin Covey and those people were out there to try to help us. Stephen Covey, that years ago would write on that.
7 Habits.
There's all kinds of variations of Covey's work, but it's always trying to get us to focus on what's most important. But we still focus on what's not sometimes, or we have too many important things. I'm glad you mentioned Steve's book. The best part of his Audible is he reads it, and he's Australian. You get this great Australian accent, and he's a great storyteller. So I hope to bring him on this podcast at some point. Well, you have a legendary wife, at least in my eyes and the eyes of many. Mm-hmm. Nancy is a phenomenal leader in her own right. She has served on pastoral roles, I know of, at least in a couple different places that you have served. And for those who are listening who are married to someone who also is in the trenches of ministry leadership, how do you keep work at work? That is, how do you keep the ministry? Because if your relationship's anything like the relationship I have with my wife, who's very engaged in ministry, not in a paid way, but in a deeply involved way, there's times where I have to say, once we enter into like the bedroom area or something, I don't mean anything by that, by the way, but I mean, just there's got to be.
You don't, Bill. We all know where you were headed with that. I don't mean anything by that. And you're not vain about being rumpled either.
We're gonna have to cut that part. No, and there's
no, you can't cut that part. I will refuse to sign off on this interview if you cut that part.
All right, we'll keep that part. But there's got to be a space in your house where you're like, in this room, we don't talk about church.
Yeah. So for Nance and I, when we dated each other, we knew that we were both interested in ministry, but it wasn't what pulled us together. We enjoy each other a lot.
Yeah.
And we've certainly had lots of issues and seasons of intense, difficult stuff to work through. But there's pretty much always been a sense of enjoying each other and also of being interested in ministry and how does church ministry work. There have been adjustments in that. Talking about leadership, if you think about leadership as a spiritual gift, Nancy's gift of leadership is much higher than mine. And I'm more of a communicator. When we first got married, I would never have been able to acknowledge that even to myself.
Yeah.
And then over time, it became unavoidably clear, and it was immensely painful for me for a while. And I felt like, oh man, she's just going to keep going up and up and up, and I'm going to go down and down and down. And then going through the pain, a question that was super helpful to me is, do I want to be the kind of man whose wife has to diminish her gifts in order for me to feel good about myself?
Wow.
And when I would ruminate over my limits and her gifts, that question was really helpful to me, because if I was just ruminating, I could spiral into all kinds of negative scenarios. But when I would come back to that question, do I want her to have to be less so I can feel better about me? I knew the answer to that was no. And so eventually it got to the point where a long time ago it hit this point. I just love the fact that she has the gifts that she does and that she's able to lead so well and celebrate that and share and feel great freedom with that, and no need to have any amount of that attached to my own self with it. So there have been those kind of, when we're both involved in ministry, what does she do well? What do I do well? What does she do better than me? How do we think through that stuff? And then as well, particularly when we were in Chicago and we both worked at the same church and we had kids at home, where it would actually probably have been okay for us to talk about that stuff a lot, but the kids got sick of it and they actually said to us, "You're talking too much about work." So we had to put a moratorium on when we come home, when we have dinner, when the family is together, we will not talk about that. And that was a very deliberate, intentional
it's tough when you love the ministry, when you're called to the ministry, and then you're, in the trenches of it. It can sometimes crowd out all hobbies, interests, others. So if you're not talking about it, there's not a lot. And so I love that my kids have been there too. My kids have definitely been there too. And I before we get to the how do you strike a boundary here, is I appreciate that that vulnerability, that asking yourself, do I want to suppress my spouse's gifts? Mm-hmm. And in order for me to have a certain position or feel good about who I am, and in all truth, it took me years to come to that realization in my own home. I thought I'm the one called to this, and she's supporting, and she's far wiser and smarter. And there were many a conversation that was, if you'd have taken my advice a while ago, we wouldn't be, or you wouldn't be, or this wouldn't be in this situation. And I moved from resentment to actually realization, and then now we joke about it all the time. Yeah. In fact, in our home, we have a day once a year when I'm right about something, and we celebrate that. That one moment when I'm like, hey, wait, I'm right about this.
Kind of like the Day of Atonement.
Yeah, it turns
once a year you're allowed to go into the Holy of Holies.
Yeah, and she always has that look like, don't get too excited. Yeah, I get the rest of the year. Yeah, but all right, let's talk about the boundary side. How do your kids obviously were one part of it, is like, hey, could we not talk about this? Yeah. And do you have anything like that set up, or have you had that set up?
We're both super P on the Myers-Briggs.
Okay.
So organized boundaries and that kind of stuff. Like, the fact that we started out with 3 kids and they're all 3 still alive, we feel really, really good about. But so it'll be a much more informal, spontaneous process for us. But for sure, Nancy actually will talk about this quite a lot. A study that involved a couple different schools that found, when we asked the question, what sustains people in ministry leadership, a big litmus test was, do they have a hobby in which they engage during which time seems to stand still?
Wow. Well, that's interesting.
Isn't it?
Okay, what's your hobby?
And so I love to surf. I'm not good at it, but I love to surf.
Hey, all right.
I enjoy playing golf. I used to be a tennis player when I was growing up, but I shifted over into golf. I love to read. I love music. I play the piano. I'm not good at it, but I play recreationally, but I enjoy that a lot. I enjoy traveling with Nancy a lot. But yeah, I think it's just super important for people that are doing ministry, or really in leadership in any way, that your life be way bigger than your job.
That's good. That is so good. I just as you say that, I'm thinking, yeah, that's true. In my home, this is how nerdy my wife and I are. She loves ancient Egypt. Like,
oh, cool.
Every documentary, we know the main historians of ancient Egypt from all these documentaries. Haven't been there yet. And I am fascinated with the Roman Empire. So we joke that we each have something to tell the other person. And sometimes they overlap, in different eras.
I just got the Audible book, SPQR.
Oh, is that it? Yeah, I've read it twice. That's Mary Beard, and she's amazing.
I've just downloaded it 2 days ago, so I'm eager to start.
My wife jokes. I always tell her that if I inherited millions of dollars, I would go on vacation and hire Mary Beard to go with us as a family vacation to give us the inside tour of Rome. That lady, some great documentaries. All right. I'm gonna get too deep in the weeds on this one. So, all right, you and Nancy both have experienced some ups and downs in ministry. Just what have you learned in both extremes? What have you learned about yourself, about God, during the ministry ups and the ministry downs?
I would say in the ups, the joy of being able to contribute and be involved in ways where you feel fully alive. Eric Little from Chariots of Fire, when I run, I feel his pleasure in me.
That's such a great image.
And it's not really at all about scale. It's just about the joy of running when you were made to run. I always love that verse from Psalm 19 that the Son rejoices like a strong man rejoices to run his course.
Yeah.
And so that picture of being able to do ministry with that sense, I love a lot. In the down areas, it would be much fuller and richer. I would say one of them would be, I used to think that life was supposed to be joyful, and if there was pain, it was my job to try to fix it and stop it. And now my understanding is much more, there will always be deep pain, and there can be deep goodness together with it. And they're like two faucets that are on in the bathtub. And so to be able to embrace the goodness and joy and live with, name, honor the pain and the hurt, and to meet other people in that place. Like there's a lot of people I'm able to meet with and talk with because they know that I've been through painful stuff that I never would have been able to if I hadn't.
You know, you think about how often in the New Testament the word persevere shows, in the Old Testament as well. And it's not something we preach on, teach on, or muse on a whole lot. Mm-hmm. And part of that probably is in general, our lives in the Western world, pretty good.
Yeah.
But thinking in terms of God meeting us in both places, in both extremes, that in his omnipresence, maybe that's the joy of those old creeds. So few churches are creedal, and mine is not creedal based, but sometimes you repeat those creeds about things of God's omnipresence, and he can meet you in all places and in all situations. So.
And there's words that can only come to mean something to you when you enter into a situation that is different. And one of the phrases that I read over these last couple of years that's been helpful, there's an old spiritual guide writer named Francis Fenelon, and he writes about a cross, and he says, sometimes resisting the cross is harder than the cross itself. So when there is suffering and you can't fix it, the prayer, your will be done, and surrender, and just, that the Serenity Prayer, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference. That takes on a whole different meaning when there is a really difficult cross. And if my mindset is, this is terrible, this is awful, I can't stand this, this must not happen, that can actually create even more suffering or more unnecessary suffering than the object of suffering itself.
Well, and so often we know those first few lines of the Serenity Prayer, but when you read the whole thing in its entirety, that to accept the world as it is, right? Not as I want it to be. But,
the courage to know the difference, taking one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking the world as he did, not as I want it, but as it is, knowing that he will make everything right if I surrender fully to him, so that I might be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever.
Like that. Now people are going to Google the Serenity Prayer because everyone thought they knew the Serenity Prayer, but they really only know the first few lines. But the thing in its entirety is tremendous. It is absolutely beautiful. Well, connected to this, the ups and downs idea is, how do you avoid both? And maybe avoid's the wrong term, but how do you come to terms with the idealism that a lot of ministry is built on, and at the same time avoid or deal with the cynicism that can come with ministry experience. You think in our early days, we were going to save the world and build churches. And then 20, 30 years later, there's, I think of every British Anglican priest. If you ever watch British dramas, I asked a friend of mine who's from England, I said, why is every priest in every British drama a fake? And he goes, no, that's what they do. They poke fun, but they always kind of have this, I'm giving up type of deal. And I'm not picking on Anglican priests, by the way. But so how do we avoid both the idealism or the cynicism, or maybe come to terms with it, maybe not avoid it?
Yeah. It's a great question, but I don't know if I've ever thought about it in that way before. I sure think for all of us who do ministry, there's just going to be a journey, and there's certain things that you can't learn except by experience.
Okay.
So I think the hopefulness of youth is a natural thing, and the acceptance of limitations is going to be more informed as we get older. I think cynicism is a really important thing to guard against, and churches tend to be places that breed cynicism. And cynicism is different than skepticism. You can be skeptical that it's going to rain tomorrow. You can't be cynical that it's going to rain tomorrow. Cynicism is always about people.
Yeah.
And I think there's always something fearful about cynicism because, going back to the Serenity Prayer, courage involves facing, naming, taking action. And I don't know of any courageous, cynical people.
No.
And so I think as we grow older, to keep asking in this situation, what would a courageous person do? Can help me not go down the path of cynicism.
I like that. If you think about cynicism, I'm a Gen Xer, so born with a chip on my shoulder type of deal. And that was all part of this was, in my coming up years, was the era of grunge, which wasn't really pleasant music to listen to. No one's really listening to that right now. Maybe it'll make a comeback. Yeah. But it had kind of this darker tone kind of thing. But it actually, cynicism is a coward's way out. I mean, to take it the opposite of it's courageous not to be cynical. In other words, to just go, whatever. Right. That's actually just weak. Yeah. But it's a protective shell.
It's weak, but it doesn't feel weak. It enables you to hide.
That's right.
The choice of fear and avoidance. Yeah. And that's always toxic to the spirit.
All right, happier subject.
Yes.
What are your devotional habits? How do you feed your soul?
Yeah. So for the last couple of years, when it's been a more intense season, I will find myself waking up during the night every night. And so I've needed to have just a plan for what do I do. And initially, I would always get up and read and do the first few pages of Henry Nouwen, who is a good person to read in a time of pain. Now, my wife and I live in a one-room cabana that we rent from folks. So I don't have another room that I can go away to. So I will listen to a talk from Dallas Willard. There's just tons of those talks online. And then when I get up, I'll say this for anybody listening to us so that they don't feel oppressed. Dallas Willard would often talk about the notion of a daily quiet time is a burden that just crushes the life out of a lot of people.
Wow. Say that again. Just say that one more time.
The idea of a daily quiet time is a burden that crushes the life out of a lot of people.
Wow.
And I think it's really important to recognize that. When I was a kid growing up, in the tradition that I grew up in, if somebody asked, how's your spiritual life going, which is a great way to kill a conversation.
Of course.
But if they did, my immediate thought would be, have my devotions been regular and long?
Sure.
And if they have, my spiritual life's going great. And I realized at one point, if you measure spiritual maturity by devotional practices, the Pharisees would come out on top.
Oh.
So how do we measure spiritual life in a way that doesn't make the Pharisees come out on top? Mm-hmm. And I asked Dallas that one time, and he said he would ask himself, am I growing more or less irritable these days? And am I growing more or less easily discouraged these days? Mm. Because if I'm living in the love of Jesus, I will be less irritable. And if the peace of Christ is reigning in my heart, I will be less easily discouraged. So this is all by preamble by way of saying, over the last couple of years, when I get up in the morning, mostly just because the level of pain and difficulty in my life has been quite great, I have had to have time to be alone with God just to get a thought that can help me move forward through the day. And so I will start by reciting the Lord's Prayer and kind of placing myself in that while I stand up. Ignatius talked about just take a moment before you enter in, and then I'll sit down. I will go through Psalm 121. When my dad died 2.5 years ago, I was reciting the last words of that psalm. The Lord will watch over your coming out, your going in, both now and forevermore. Took his last breath, never breathed in. So I will use that as a way of saying, help me with this. I will go through what are 3 things that I was grateful for yesterday. I will take some time to do just kind of mindful prayer, where I'm mostly breathing, maybe around the word of peace. And then I will do a bit of scripture and then think through my day yesterday and who were people that I was meeting with. So that's ways that I'll start my morning. I have a good friend, Rick Blackman, and every morning at 6:15, Monday through Friday, we call each other up. How was your day yesterday? Temptations, what'd you face? What are you doing today? Pray with each other. We love that. So that's my morning.
Well, it always is, to me, one of the most fascinating questions to ask a spiritual leader is how they feed their soul. I love your answers to that. During the pandemic, I grew up Baptist and Lutheran. So Baptist church, Lutheran school.
Oh, wow.
And so part of our religion class was Luther's Small Catechism. Mm-hmm. And I had to, for class, memorize parts of it.
Wow.
So I went back to re-memorize parts of it.
That's wonderful.
And I have found, of all things, now this isn't in Luther's Small, but that was the gateway into the Athanasian Creed. Huh. And so as I fall asleep at night, I recite what I can remember, because that anyone who has creeds memorized knows the Athanasian is a real long one. So I can't say as it's committed fully to memory, but it helps me fall asleep at night. Mm-hmm. And like yourself, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I turn to the Lord's Prayer. Mm-hmm. And if I am still awake, then I move into I just start mulling over one of the creeds. I fall asleep to the Trinity. It's pretty good. It's not bad.
Trinity's a good thing to fall asleep toward.
All right, last question. You get the Bible and one book to sit with for the next 365 days. Mm-hmm. 1 year, Bible, and just that one book.
Yeah, super easy. The Spirit of the Disciplines. It's a book by Dallas Willard. It's the first book of his that I read, and it has impacted me by far the most of any book that I have ever read. And I can just keep going back and going back and going back through it. I can still remember the seat that I was sitting on in the plane when I read, he said, the thesis is that authentic transformation is genuinely possible if we're willing to do one thing, and that is to arrange our lives around the rhythms and practices Jesus engaged in, to remain fully at home with and receive power from the Father. I was like, somebody has thought this out.
That's it.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to guess Dallas Willard, but I wasn't going to guess the book.
You're going to be right.
So, very good. Well, John, thanks so much for sitting down for this conversation. I have found it personally enriching. I know those who are listening will find it enriching as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Bill. It's a joy.
Thank you for listening to Leadership Journey, part of the Group Talk Network of podcasts. If you like what you've heard, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more, make sure you check out smallgroupnetwork.com for more resources.